This is the story of how my son's wedding turned into my public execution. One moment, I was sitting quietly at a table in the St. Regis ballroom, trying to blend into a family that made it painfully clear I didn't belong. The next moment, his new mother-in-law lifted a bowl of boiling gumbo and hurled it into my face. Guests screamed, silverware dropped, but my son, my only son, didn't move, didn't defend me, didn't even flinch. He crossed his arms and said, "She's right, Mama." And while the soup burned my skin, his words burned something far deeper. Pain has a strange quality when it happens in front of a crowd. It becomes heavier, sharper, not because of the heat itself, but because of the eyes watching. In those first seconds, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel outrage. I felt exposed, like someone had ripped the skin from my chest and left my heart beating in open air. The gumbo dripped slowly from my chin, gathering at the collar of my dress, a dress I had sewn with my own hands. I remember the absurdity of that detail rising in me like my mind was grasping for anything familiar. I raised my hand to wipe my cheek but stopped halfway. My hand was shaking, not from the burn but from the realization that Angela Dupree had planned this. Her movements had been too smooth, her expression too calm. Her eyes met mine dark, still satisfied, the kind of satisfaction people don't show unless they've been waiting a long time to see someone break. And yet, the room waited for me to react, as though my pain needed their approval to exist. I didn't give them anything. I set the napkin against my cheek, slow, deliberate. A trembling gasp rippled through the tables, as if the quiet dignity hurt them more than the attack itself. But Malcolm, he remained motionless. My son, my child, my entire life's work. When I looked at him, it was like looking into a shadow that had once been a boy. I loved so fiercely, I thought the bond was unbreakable. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't look torn. He looked resolved, as if this was the moment he had chosen sides. When he repeated, "She's right, Mama," something ancient inside me cracked the part of a mother that believes her love alone can protect her from her child's betrayal. There is no protection from that. None. The ballroom was too warm, too bright. My skin throbbed where the soup had struck, but it felt distant, like the burn belonged to someone else. What I felt instead was a heaviness sinking through my chest, filling my lungs with something dense and hard to breathe. I heard someone whisper, "Did you see what she did?" Another murmured, "God." Her own mother-in-law. But there was no compassion in their voices, just the thrill of witnessing another person's unraveling. I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the floor, a harsh, grating sound that seemed too loud in a room full of people who refused to move. No one reached for me. No one offered a hand or a word or even a glance of acknowledgement. It struck me then I had never truly been part of this family. I had been tolerated, studied, weighed, and judged, and finally discarded. My footsteps felt strangely detached, like I was watching myself from above a woman in a soaked dress, walking steadily toward the double doors while humiliation clung to her like smoke. As I walked, I could feel eyes slicing down my back, some in shock, some in satisfaction, some pretending not to care, but leaning ever so slightly to see more. But not one belonged to my son. Near the doorway, I paused, not because I wanted to, but because something inside me insisted that I take in this moment fully. The moment my world ended, the moment a new one began. I heard the music stop behind me. Then chairs shifting. A muffled command from someone trying to control the chaos. A single stifled sob whose I will never know. I kept my back straight even as my heart folded in on itself. When I reached the doors, the chill of the brass handle shocked my palm. The cold metal felt grounding, almost merciful. I pushed the door open and stepped into a quieter corridor where the air was cooler, less suffocating. Only then did I exhale. Not a sob, not a cry, just a long, trembling breath. A breath that felt like releasing the idea of the child Malcolm used to be. Behind me, the ballroom's noise returned, footsteps, hushed voices, the orchestra faltering into silence. I could still hear Angela's voice, sharper than all of it. "That's what you deserve." The corridor lights buzzed faintly. The echo of my heels against the marble floor sounded foreign to me, too loud, too alone. I reached up to wipe my face again, and this time, the sting hit me fully. My skin pulsed with heat, as if the burn had finally caught up with me. I pressed my palm over my cheek, and for a moment, the physical pain mercifully drowned the emotional one. But only for a moment. As I walked farther down the hall, a thought rose quietly inside me, steady and cold. This wasn't about the soup. It was about erasing me, erasing my presence, my history with Malcolm, my place in his life. None of this made sense yet, not fully. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the shock, beneath the ache of betrayal, I felt the shape of something darker forming. Angela wanted me out of the picture. And Malcolm, he allowed it. But why? What had I missed? What had I failed to see? The questions circled me, hollow and heavy. I reached the far end of the corridor where the noise from the ballroom softened into faint, indecipherable murmurs. There in the quiet, the truth pressed against me with unbearable simplicity. Whatever was happening to my son, whatever had claimed him, had been happening long before this night. And for the first time I felt afraid. Not of Angela. Not of the room of strangers who watched me burn. I was afraid of the answer I didn't yet have. My clutch hung at my wrist, still damp from the spill. I opened it slowly, feeling the smooth edges of my phone beneath my fingers. My thumb hovered for only a second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This moment, this precise moment, was the point where my silence ended. I dialed the number I had memorized weeks ago, the number I hoped I would never need, the one tied to truths too dangerous to voice until now. The line clicked, breathing on the other end, calm, steady, expectant. I kept my voice quiet, almost measured, because collapse had no place here. Not anymore. It's time now. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't explain. I didn't breathe. I ended the call and let my arm fall to my side. The hallway seemed to expand around me, as though space itself was acknowledging what had just begun. Because the truth wasn't waiting inside that ballroom, the truth was already in motion, moving toward the people who believed my humiliation was the end of my story. It wasn't. It was the beginning. I walked toward the exit doors of the Street Regis with my head high and my skin still burning, but my heart felt something shifting. Not anger, not vengeance, not yet. Clarity. A clarity that comes only when someone you love destroys the last illusion that kept you blind. Behind those ballroom doors, my world had been set on fire. But out here in the cool Atlanta night, beneath the distant hum of traffic and the faint glow of street lamps, I understood something I had never allowed myself to believe. A mother's love can endure anything except being told she deserves her own suffering. And when my son said those words, when he chose cruelty over compassion, something inside me didn't just crack, it turned, quietly, slowly, irreversibly, because love, real love, cannot coexist with a lie. And whatever held Malcolm to me had already been severed long before the gumbo touched my face. Tonight only revealed it. I stepped outside, letting the night air wrap around my burning cheek. The city moved as it always did, cars passing, voices carrying life continuing, without noticing the woman standing still on the hotel steps. I closed my eyes, breathed in, let the cold settle the fire on my skin. And then, with a resolve that felt both foreign and utterly necessary, I walked into the night, carrying the kind of silence that changes everything. Before everything fractured, before the gumbo, the humiliation, the call I can never take back, there was a time when my world was small but whole. It was Malcolm and me in a tiny apartment in Atlanta's West End, the walls thin, the floors uneven, but the love thick enough to drown out everything else. Most nights I sewed wedding gowns at the kitchen table, the rhythmic hum of the machine filling the room like a heartbeat. Malcolm would sit beside me, bent over his homework, his pencil tapping lightly against the pages. Sometimes he'd talk softly, thoughtfully, asking questions about school or life, and I'd answer them without looking up my hands, guiding silk and lace the way I'd once guided his small body across sidewalks and playgrounds. Those evenings felt safe, steady, predictable in the sweetest way. But life has a way of shifting beneath you long before you realize you're standing on unsteady ground. The first shift happened on a day that should have been ordinary. Malcolm came home from work with a kind of brightness in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. The kind that signals something has begun, something that may or may not involve you. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said almost shyly. I paused mid-stitch. "Someone," he nodded. "Her name's Celeste." I had heard the name before. Buckhead families tended to float among each other like constellations visible from far below but impossible to reach. Celeste Dupree, beautiful, educated, wealthy in that casual way that doesn't need explanation. I remember smiling, even though something inside me tightened. "Bring her for dinner," I said. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me, a shadow flitting across his features before he forced a smile. "Yeah, maybe, a small word." But I felt its weight. When I first met Celeste, I couldn't deny she was lovely, soft-spoken, thoughtful, almost painfully gracious. She shook my hand with both of hers, like she genuinely wanted me to feel welcomed by her presence rather than overwhelmed by it. But then there was Angela. She entered the room like a blade. Her smile was thin and rehearsed, her eyes scanning my living room, its mismatched chairs, its faded rug, the sewing machine still threaded from the night before. She didn't have to say a word. Her gaze spoke loud enough. "You don't belong in our world." During dinner, she corrected the way I pronounced a designer's name. Later, she commented on the charming simplicity of my home. And when our plates were cleared, she leaned slightly toward Celeste, as if whispering something meant only for her, but ensuring I heard the tone, if not the words. Malcolm noticed none of it, or pretended he didn't. He sat beside her shoulder, touching shoulder, his voice softer, his laughter different. Not the belly-deep laugh I'd raised, but something polished, careful, like he was trying on a new version of himself. I told myself it was normal. Love makes people softer. Love makes people glow. But I also knew love sometimes makes people disappear. The first disappearance was small. He stopped coming by on Thursday evenings, our usual dinner night. He said he was tired. He said work was busy. He said Celeste's family had events. Each excuse had the same rhythm, polite, distant, untouchable. I tried not to hold on to the silence between us, but silence has a way of reshaping a room. Soon, even when he did visit, he seemed distracted, his eyes flickering toward his phone, his smile wilting as if he were listening to something inside him that I couldn't hear. One night, while I cooked his favorite dish, he barely looked at his plate. "Not hungry?" I asked. He shrugged. "Angela said we should be more mindful about starches." There was no malice in his tone, but the words struck something fragile in me. He had never spoken like that before, evaluating food not for taste or comfort, but for compliance. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, though inside, something trembled, like a thread pulled too tight. The next disappearance was larger. He stopped calling in the evenings. At first I didn't notice. A missed call here, a delayed message there, nothing worth panicking over. Life gets busy. Relationships demand time. But weeks passed before I realized the pattern wasn't accidental. He called less. He visited less. He offered less. And when we did talk, Celeste's family always hovered at the edges of his words, the dinners, the fundraisers, the discussions about the wedding that seemed to happen without me being included. But the worst part wasn't being excluded. It was being erased gently, quietly, politely. He spoke of his future as though his past, our past, was something that could be folded away into a drawer. I began to feel like a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of his choices. The final disappearance wasn't subtle at all. It happened at a dinner in Buckhead. Angela had invited me an invitation that surprised me so much. I prepared my outfit carefully, ironing the dress twice, checking the seams like a student seeking approval. The Duprees lived in a house that felt more like a museum than a home, quietly expensive, curated to perfection. I felt myself shrinking the moment I stepped inside, as though the walls were measuring me. During dinner, I tried to speak, to contribute, to laugh when others laughed. But each time I opened my mouth, Angela gently corrected me. "That's not quite how you pronounce it, dear. We don't usually pair red wine with that dish." "Oh, I suppose that sewing machine of yours keeps you very busy." She never raised her voice, never glared, never said anything overtly cruel. But cruelty doesn't always need volume. Sometimes it's the quietest thing in the room. Meanwhile, Malcolm. He was drifting. He wasn't beside me. He was beside them, nodding along, smiling at the right moments, absorbing their world as though it were oxygen, and mine had been nothing more than smoke. When dessert came, I reached out and touched his hand lightly. "Are you okay?" I whispered. He pulled away, not roughly but reflexively, as though my touch had interrupted something delicate. "I'm fine, Mama," he said. His tone held no warmth. That was when the fear truly settled in me. A quiet, creeping fear, not that I was losing him, but that he had already been taken. The day of Celeste's gown fitting should have been a moment of connection, a shared joy, a bridge between families. Instead, it became another rehearsal of my slow erasure. The boutique was pristine and white, the kind of place that makes you aware of every scuff on your shoes and every insecurity you've ever had. When Celeste stepped out in her gown, she looked radiant, truly radiant, and my breath caught with genuine admiration. But Angela stood behind her hand, gently rested on her daughter's shoulder, eyes fixed on me in the mirror. A small smirk lifted her lips, a smirk that said, "Watch carefully, this is how far he's slipped away from you." When I offered a suggestion, soft, simple, maternal, Angela cut through my words with a delicate laugh. "I think we'll leave the design choices to the professionals, darling." Celeste gave me an apologetic smile, but it was the kind of apology born from habit, not conviction. "And Malcolm," he stood off to the side, scrolling through his phone, barely glancing at me. I whispered to myself, the words almost sticking to my tongue. "Let it go. He's building a life. Let it go." But the truth pressed against me, undeniable and sharp. It didn't feel like growth. It felt like an eclipse, one in which I was disappearing behind someone else's shadow. That night back in my apartment, I brewed coffee even though it was late. The bitter scent rose around me, familiar and grounding, but even that couldn't settle the tightening in my chest. I sat at the table where I had once sewn Malcolm's school costumes, his Halloween outfits, the patches on his jeans. The room felt smaller now, not because it had changed, but because I suddenly understood how little of his new life could fit into it. I tried to make sense of the unease, to name it, to shape it into something that didn't feel so wild. Was it jealousy, fear, loss? None of those words felt right. What I felt was something closer to recognition that a distance had opened between us, not naturally but intentionally. By whom I wasn't ready to answer that. Not yet. But Angela's eyes kept returning to me the way she watched, measured, calculated. A predator studying a creature already bleeding. She wasn't just disapproving of me. She was claiming something, claiming someone. And the terrible thing was, Malcolm let her. I leaned back in my chair, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, staring at the quiet kitchen that had once held so much noise, so much possibility. I whispered into the silence. She wants me gone. But why? The question lingered in the air like smoke, refusing to settle. I thought about every moment leading up to this, every small correction, every tight-lipped smile, every instance Malcolm chose silence over me. Individually, they were nothing. Together, they were a pattern. a pattern I had been too hopeful, too trusting, too motherly to see. My chest tightened, my breath shortened, a low hum of dread began to pulse behind my ribs. It wasn't just that I was losing him, it was that someone was pulling him away quietly, deliberately, with a patience born of certainty. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the hurt and fear, a realization flickered, small, fragile, but impossible to ignore. Something was terribly wrong, and it was only the beginning. I knew something was wrong the moment Celeste invited me to her gown fitting. The message arrived early in the morning, a short text written with careful punctuation, formal, almost hesitant, as if she were reaching across a distance she hoped could be bridged. "It would mean a lot if you came today. I want you to see the gown." For a brief second, just one trembling second, hope flickered in me like a match in the wind. Maybe she truly wanted to include me. Maybe her world had room for me after all. Maybe Angela's disdain wasn't shared by her daughter. And for a fragile moment, I allowed myself to imagine a version of the future in which Malcolm married into that family without losing me along the way, a future where I might find my place among them, however small or imperfect. But hope is a dangerous thing when it grows inside someone who has been starving for it. The Buckhead boutique was cold in the way expensive places often are cold, because warmth is unnecessary when you assume comfort is your birthright. White silk draped from walls and mannequins, soft music hummed from hidden speakers, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and untouched luxury. When I stepped inside, I felt immediately misplaced, like a dropped stitch in a flawless seam. Celeste greeted me with a hug, gentle, warm, earnest. I felt her sincerity even if it trembled beneath the surface. She wasn't cruel. She was simply living between two worlds, each tugging her in directions she hadn't learned to resist. Then Angela emerged from behind a display of gowns, her heels echoing softly on the polished floor. Her smile was sharp, her eyes were sharper. "Ah," she said, "you made it." Her voice was smooth, the kind of smooth that hides splinters. Celeste looked hopeful, almost proud to have brought me into this moment. But Angela's hand found her daughter's arm, a silent correction, a reminder of who controlled the room. That was the first crack, the subtle shift in Celeste's posture as she responded to her mother's touch rather than her own instinct. When the consultant unveiled the gown, Celeste stepped onto the platform under the spotlight. The dress was stunning, layers of satin and lace that seemed to float around her like a whispered blessing. I felt tears rise unbidden, not from sadness, but from recognition. I knew what it meant to envision your child's happiness. I knew what it meant to build a future in your mind and pray reality would mirror it. But as I opened my mouth to compliment her, Angela moved first. "Isn't it divine?" she said, her voice low but pointed. "Exactly the kind of gown a Dupree woman should wear." Her eyes slid toward me, subtle, cold, deliberate. The implication settled like dust over my skin, and not the kind of gown a woman like you would understand. I held my breath. I smiled. I stayed still. But inside, something began to hollow itself out. A few minutes later, the consultant asked whether the waist should be taken in. Celeste turned to me instinctively, eyes bright with trust. "What do you think?" she asked. For a moment I felt seen, felt included. I stepped forward gently, pressing the fabric at her waist. "Maybe just a little," I whispered. "Enough to keep the shape but not too tight. You should breathe easily on your wedding day." Celeste smiled. It was genuine, soft, warm. But Angela's voice cut through the moment like thread snapped too sharply. "We will have the designer make that call," she said. Her tone was even, but her gaze held something colder. Celeste froze. Her smile faltered. She withdrew ever so slightly from my touch, as if she feared choosing me over her mother, even in something as small as a dress fitting. And Malcolm. He stood in the corner, scrolling through his phone, not looking up, not noticing the exchange, not seeing me. Or maybe he chose not to. Every silence from him felt like a blade pressing softly between my ribs, not enough to kill, but enough to remind me that something within him had changed, something or someone. As the fitting continued, Angela found new ways to remind me of my place. Little comments, light laughs, a raised eyebrow here, a dismissive glance there. Some fabrics are difficult to appreciate unless you've worked with high-quality material. "Oh, that's adorable. You think the hemline should stay. Don't worry, the wedding planner will handle everything. It's complicated." Each sentence slid beneath my skin like thin, precise cuts, quiet, polite, lethal. And Malcolm's silence was the antiseptic poured into each wound, making them burn deeper. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't a cultural gap, a generational gap, or a misunderstanding between women. This was removal. Deliberate, orchestrated removal. I felt it happening in real time, the way one senses a storm coming long before the first drop falls, pressure gathering air, thickening breath, shortening. At one point, Celeste stepped off the platform to change into another gown, leaving me briefly alone with Angela. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes traveled from my shoes to my neckline slowly, deliberately, as though cataloging every detail she found inadequate. Then she stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and muted and designed to linger in the air long after she left a room. In a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "This world requires elevation. I hope you understand that." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an insult. It was a declaration of hierarchy, of borders, of a line drawn around her family, one that didn't include me. Something in me recoiled. Something else hardened. But before I could speak, Celeste stepped back into the room, glowing in another gown, unaware of the war being waged in the space she had invited me into. And I swallowed my words. For her, for Malcolm, for the remnants of a family I thought I still belonged to. The final blow didn't come from Angela. It came from Malcolm himself. As Celeste admired herself in the mirror, I approached him quietly. "Malcolm," I whispered. "Do you have a minute?" He didn't look up. I tried again, my voice gentler, more fragile than I intended. "Malcolm, are you happy?" He exhaled a short, irritated breath. "Mama, not now. Not now." As though my concern, my fear, my place in his life were interruptions rather than foundations. I felt something heavy sink inside me. Not anger, not disappointment, recognition. The boy who once asked for my guidance had grown into a man who no longer wanted it. Or maybe he wanted it, but from someone else. Someone shaping him quietly. Someone directing him subtly. Someone pulling him away gently enough that he didn't notice or didn't care. And I understood in that moment why Angela smiled the way she did. She wasn't fighting me. She had already won. When the fitting ended, Celeste hugged me again. "Thank you for being here," she whispered. I believed she meant it. But behind her, Angela watched the embrace with a gaze sharp enough to slice through silk. As I stepped outside the boutique, the afternoon sun felt too bright, too clean, too indifferent to the ache blooming inside my chest. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, letting the sounds of Buckhead wash over me. Cars, distant chatter, the clacking of heels on pavement, all of it blending into a hum that made me feel small, tiny, misplaced. Standing in a world that had already decided my relevance. I walked to my car slowly, my breaths shallow each inhale, catching on something I couldn't quite name. A fear, a truth, a premonition. Something was coming, something I wasn't prepared for. Something that would unravel everything I thought I knew. That night, back in my apartment, I brewed coffee again, though my hands shook as I poured the water. The steam rose like a ghost from the mug, curling around my fingers, warming a part of me that had gone cold hours earlier. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Malcolm once colored on scrap fabric while I sewed, where he ate spaghetti with too much cheese, where he whispered secrets about school and heartbreak and dreams. Now it felt like a shrine to a life that no longer existed. I pressed my palms to the warm ceramic cup, grounding myself in the only warmth I could control, and I whispered into the quiet, "She wants me gone. But why?" The question wasn't new, but tonight it felt heavier, more urgent, more dangerous, because the fear curling in my chest wasn't just fear of losing my son, it was fear of what and who I was losing him to. Angela wasn't just protective, she wasn't just controlling, she wasn't just dismissive, she was strategic. Her moves were measured, her influence subtle, her dominance masked by etiquette and poise, and she had her hands on the two people Malcolm cared about most, Celeste and him. I didn't know the truth yet, but it was coming toward me steady and unstoppable, like a shadow growing longer at dusk. Something was wrong. Wrong in a way that went beyond marriage, beyond class, beyond differences in how families operate. Wrong in a way that made my skin prickle and my heart tighten and my breath shorten. Wrong in a way that whispered, "You're not imagining this. You're in danger of losing more than your place in his life." I wrapped my fingers around the mug, holding it like a lifeline. I did not cry. Not yet. But the cracks had widened, and the silence inside me had begun to roar. It arrived on a Tuesday, quietly, without ceremony, without warning, just a soft knock on the glass door of my shop and a delivery boy holding a manila envelope as ordinary as a grocery receipt. No return address, no sender. Nothing but my name, handwritten in black ink, the ink slightly smudged, as if someone had hesitated before committing to the act. I should have sensed the truth then. I should have felt the shift in the air. But fatigue can dull intuition, and grief that hasn't yet revealed its face, can silence even the loudest alarms. So I signed for it, thanked the boy, watched him disappear down the sidewalk without ever realizing he had just handed me the death of the life I thought I knew. Inside the shop, the sewing machines slept in their usual hum of silence, thread spools stacked like tiny monuments to a life built with my hands. For years, this space had held me together, its routine, its rhythm, its familiarity. But that day, the air felt heavier, weighted with something invisible, yet deliberate. I set the envelope on my cutting table. My fingertips brushed its edge. The paper was warm from the delivery boy's hands. I didn't open it right away. Something inside me, some old, stubborn instinct whispered, "Not yet." But curiosity is its own kind of gravity, and gravity always wins. The flap tore with a soft hiss. Photographs spilled out, dozens of them, glossy and bright, the kind printed by someone who didn't mind paying extra for clarity. The first one landed face up. My breath collapsed. A thin gasp, raw and sharp, tore through my throat, because in that photograph was Malcolm, my son, my baby. And beside him, too close, far too close, was Angela Dupree. Her hand rested on his arm like it belonged there. His head leaned toward her, the way men lean toward women they shouldn't love. My knees softened, the floor tilted, the photograph blurred before my eyes. "No," the word escaped before I could stop it. I lifted the next photo. A restaurant patio in Midtown. Dim lighting. Wine glasses half filled, her body angled toward his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture that felt intimate, practiced, claiming. My vision tightened at the edges. Another photo. A hotel entrance, the Street Regis, her lips grazing his cheek, his smile soft, familiar, devastating. Then another, the two of them walking into a Midtown apartment, her coat slipping off one shoulder, his hand catching it before it fell. Photographs from different days, different outfits, different lighting. The pattern was unmistakable. My son wasn't simply entangled, he was involved, deeply, dangerously, shamefully. I didn't realize I had moved until I felt my hand gripping the edge of my work table. The photographs kept coming like a story being forced into my hands, one frame at a time. Then, the final image. A balcony, nighttime. City lights painting their faces in gold. Angela standing in front of him, her eyes closed, his arms wrapped around her waist. Not seduction, not accident, intimacy, real, undeniable, fatal. The breath left my body so fast I felt hollowed out. Like someone had taken a vacuum to my chest. I couldn't hold the photographs anymore. They slipped from my fingers, scattering across the floor like shards of a life smashed beyond repair. And then the nausea hit, sudden, violent, uncontrollable. I stumbled toward the waste bin but didn't make it in time. I fell to my knees and vomited onto the shop floor, my palms pressed against cold tile as my body convulsed with a grief that had been waiting, patient, silent, merciless. It wasn't anger, not yet, not even betrayal. It was something more primitive, a collapsing, cavernous sorrow, a sorrow that comes from realizing your child is not who you believed him to be. When the retching stopped, I stayed on the floor, trembling breath, shaking in broken waves. I didn't cry. Not then. Tears require understanding. I had none. It took nearly an hour before I could gather the photographs into a pile. My hands shook so violently that some prints slipped away again, skidding across the tile as if trying to escape my touch. I placed them back in the envelope, though the envelope felt too thin, too flimsy to contain something so monstrous. My son, and her, Angela, the woman who had humiliated me, dismissed me, watched me with eyes that stripped me down to nothing. There had always been something in her gaze, an ownership, a coldness, a hunger. But this was a different kind of hunger. A hunger that couldn't be explained by cruelty alone. By evening, my shock had sharpened into something more precise: fear. Not the fear of losing Malcolm, though, that ache throbbed beneath every breath. Not the fear of humiliation, though, shame clung to my skin like smoke. But fear of something darker, bigger, calculating. Because as I replayed each photograph in my mind, patterns emerged, motives lurked, and questions gathered like storm clouds. Why would a woman like Angela risk everything for my son? Why so secretive? Why so reckless? People like her don't destroy reputations lightly. They don't gamble unless the prize is worth the risk. And Malcolm, my sweet boy who once cried when he accidentally stepped on a ladybug. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't cunning, but he was vulnerable to admiration, to validation, to the intoxicating pull of wealth and approval he had never known before. Someone like Angela could twist that vulnerability into anything she wanted. Anything. That night, in a half-state between desperation and instinct, I called a name I hadn't spoken aloud in years, a private investigator in Decatur, referred to me by a client whose husband had once led a double life. His name was Booker. His voice on the phone was calm but alert, like a man accustomed to walking into the ruins of other people's illusions. "I'll need details," he said. My voice cracked. "I don't have explanations, just photographs. That's enough to begin." We met in a diner with flickering lights and coffee that tasted like burnt patience. The envelope sat between us like a ticking bomb. As he flipped through the photographs, his expression didn't change. But his silence grew heavier, a silence that stretched, gathered weight, hinted that he saw more in these images than I wanted to understand. When he finally spoke, his tone was matter-of-fact, clinical, almost detached. "This wasn't a fling." My stomach tightened. "This was planned," he continued. "Coordinated. Maintained." I swallowed hard. "How long?" He slid a document toward me, cell phone records, dates, overlapping locations. "Over a year," he said. The words fell like stones into water, each one sinking deeper, deeper, deeper. My heart clenched around the truth, too stunned to beat properly. A year. The words tasted foreign, impossible, poisonous. Booker nodded gently, as if guiding a dying patient through their final breaths. "And there's more." He pulled out bank records. Not mine, Not Malcolm's, Angela's. Transfers, payments, regular, steadily increasing, thousands at a time. She's been paying him, supporting him, Booker corrected, positioning him, elevating him, the room tilted, supporting him, like a benefactor or an owner. My hand flew to my mouth. What does she want from him? I whispered. Booker hesitated for the first time. A role in a plan that doesn't benefit your son. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. What plan? He slid an audio transcript across the table. His eyes softened, not with pity, but with preparation. There's talk, he said quietly. About Celeste. About her inheritance. My breath hitched. She's wealthy, he continued, and there are conditions tied to that wealth. He said the next words slowly, as if pulling them from a wound. There was mention of accidents. The world stopped. Sound, light, motion all collapsed into a single point of horror. An accident. For Celeste, a girl barely old enough to marry. A girl who smiled at me with kindness, with trust. My stomach twisted so violently I thought I might be sick again. You're saying, my son, I couldn't finish. I'm saying, Booker interrupted gently, that your son is being used, manipulated, weaponized. The word struck me like a blow. Weaponized. Against whom? Against a girl who loved him. Against a family he was marrying into. Against himself. No mother prepares for the moment she must consider her child's moral collapse. No mother imagines standing at the edge of a truth that threatens to swallow her whole. I felt myself folding inward, mind, heart, breath. But there was no time to crumble, no space for collapse. Some truths demand action before emotion. Some betrayals require clarity before grief. Booker's voice softened. You need to proceed carefully, he said. This is bigger than infidelity. I nodded, though the motion felt distant, mechanical. Because beneath all the shock, all the terror, all the unraveling, a new thought emerged, quiet, fierce, undeniable. Angela hadn't taken my son by accident. She had taken him with purpose. She had taken him to build something dark, something profitable, something destructive, and whatever that something was, Malcolm was already entangled in it. Tangled so deeply he might not know how to crawl back out. When I left the diner, the night air struck me like a slap. Sharp, sober, unforgiving. I stood in the parking lot, clutching the envelope against my chest, as if it were both a bomb and a lifeline. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The grief sat too deep, too heavy, too stunned for tears. Instead, I whispered into the darkness a vow, a prayer, a plea. God, let me save him before he destroys himself. Because now I understood the truth with terrifying clarity. My son's betrayal wasn't a beginning. It was a symptom. The real threat was Angela, her intelligence, her ambition, her manipulation, her willingness to use Malcolm as a pawn, her vision of a future where Celeste would not exist long enough to inherit what was meant for her, a future where Malcolm would walk away wealthier and far more broken than I could bear to imagine. I pressed my forehead against the roof of my car. My breath trembled. My hands trembled. My heart trembled. But my resolve did not. I would not lose him. Not to her. Not to greed. Not to darkness. Not like this. And without realizing it, the fear inside me began to harden slowly, quietly into something sharper, something closer to steel. There are moments in life when action arrives not as a choice, but as a sentence passed quietly without appeal. The morning after Booker handed me the truth, I woke with that sentence thrumming beneath my skin. I couldn't go to the police, not yet. Anything premature could tip Angela off and accelerate whatever she had planned. So I did the only thing left. I drove to Inman Park, not to a friend, not to a pastor. Not to someone who might hold my shaking hands and whisper that things would eventually be all right. I drove to the one person who had the power to stop what was coming. The one person with as much to lose as I did, and far more influence to wield. Harlan Dupree, Celeste's grandfather. The old lion of Atlanta's business world retired but not diminished. A man built from steel, long years and a lifetime of knowing exactly when to bare his teeth. His house sat beneath the canopy of old trees, their branches twisting like veins across the sky. The windows glowed with a dim amber light, as though the home itself knew the weight of the stories held inside. I sat in my car for several minutes before getting out, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers numbed. My breath fogged the windshield. My heart beat slow and heavy, as if bracing itself for impact. When I finally stepped into the cold morning air, I felt the truth inside the manila envelope pressing against my ribs from inside my purse, each photograph a piece of a nightmare I still wasn't sure I was awake from. I rang the doorbell only once. That was all it took. The door opened to reveal a housekeeper who recognized me from the engagement dinner months earlier. Her expression shifted something between surprise and concern, but she stepped aside without a word. "He's in the study," she said softly. "He doesn't sleep much these days. Neither did I." The study smelled of old books, tobacco that hadn't been smoked in years, and the faintest trace of cedar. Harlan Dupree sat by the window, the morning light outlining the edges of his shoulders like an aura cut from stone. When he turned, I saw the exhaustion in his face, the kind that comes not from age but from burdens carried alone. He gestured to the seat across from him. "You look troubled," he began. I didn't sit, not yet. My legs felt too weak to trust. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition of impending truth. "What is that?" he asked. For a moment, the room felt unbearably small, tight, unbreathable. "Evidence," I whispered. He didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, inviting, demanding, resigned. "Show me." I placed the photographs on the table one by one, each landing with a soft, devastating thud. As they spread across the polished wood, the weight of them seemed to shift the air itself. Harlan leaned forward slowly. He didn't pick up a single picture. He simply stared. "My son." His hand on Angela's waist, Angela's lips grazing his cheek. The two of them entering a hotel lobby under dim lights, a midtown apartment door closing behind them. His expression didn't change, not at first. But his hand gripped the armrest until his knuckles whitened. When he finally spoke, his voice scraped the air like something forced through grief. "My granddaughter," he whispered. "My baby?" The words trembled not with fragility but with a fury so deep it bordered on sorrow. I felt my throat tighten. "She doesn't know," I said softly. He swallowed not a small swallow but a heavy, dragging one, as though trying to force down a truth his heart refused to accept. "And she loves him," he murmured. "Yes." He reached out then, not for the pictures but for the audio files I'd saved to a USB drive. I handed it to him with trembling fingers. He plugged it into a small speaker on his desk. The voices crackled to life, Angela's smooth, measured tone discussing inheritance conditions, contingency plans, unfavorable outcomes. And then Malcolm's voice, hesitant, uncertain, miserable but complicit. The recording wasn't loud, but it might as well have been thunder shattering the walls. When the audio ended, silence slammed into the room like a final verdict. Harlan didn't move, didn't blink, didn't look away. He simply sat frozen by the unbearable truth that his granddaughter had been living in the shadow of a threat she couldn't see. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Over a year." "And money?" "Yes. She's been supporting him financially." His eyes closed, not in disbelief, but in calculation. "And these accidents?" I nodded, unable to speak. The silence stretched between us, heavy, suffocating, alive with a shared horror. I could hear my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears, the ticking of an old clock on the wall. His breath rough and uneven. Finally, he inhaled a deep, steady breath pulled from a place far older than strength. Then he straightened. The motion was slow, deliberate, dignified, like watching a dormant creature rise from long sleep bones, trembling not from weakness but from rage sharpened by purpose. His age fell away, his grief transformed. He looked at me with eyes no longer clouded by shock. "Attend the wedding," he said softly. The command was quiet, but it carried a weight that settled deep in my spine. "Why?" I asked, barely able to push the word past my lips. He didn't hesitate. "When the moment arrives, call me." My breath hitched. "Mr. Dupree, I will take care of everything." There was no menace in his tone, no vindictive sharpness, no threats, just certainty. Cold, final, absolute. I felt something shift in the air, something irrevocable, and for the first time in months I felt a strange, icy certainty settle in my bones. This story would not end quietly. We sat in silence for several minutes, long enough for the morning light to shift across the floorboards, long enough for my breathing to return to something like normal. Finally, I found the courage to ask the question I dreaded. "What will you do?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "What must be done," he said at last. "Nothing more, nothing less." I felt a tremor run through me, not fear, not relief, but recognition. He was a man who had spent his entire life protecting what was his, and Celeste, sweet, gentle Celeste, was his heart, his legacy, his everything. He wouldn't allow her to be harmed. He wouldn't allow Malcolm to be used against her. He wouldn't allow Angela's scheme to flourish. I sensed in him a kind of strength I didn't possess, not the strength of endurance which mothers know well, but the strength of decisive action, the strength to end things. The old lion had awakened. When I rose to leave, my knees felt unsteady, as though they were adjusting to a world that had shifted while I sat in that study. He walked me to the door himself. Halfway there, he paused. "You did the right thing coming to me," he said quietly. I nodded, though my chest felt too tight to speak. "And whatever happens next," he continued, "you must trust that I am prepared." A faint chill slid down my arms. "Prepared for what?" "For truth," he replied. "For justice." Then after a beat, "For war, if needed." The words settled into the room like a shadow, heavy, unavoidable. I exhaled slowly. He opened the door. Cold air swept in, brushing against my cheeks the way a warning touches the back of the neck. "Attend the wedding," he repeated. "And when the moment arrives, call me." His voice held no tremor, no hesitation, only resolve. I stepped outside the sunlight, suddenly too bright. The door closed behind me with a soft whisper, almost gentle, almost deceptive, almost like the closing of a coffin lid. As I walked to my car, the envelope pressed against my hip like a heartbeat. This wasn't simply evidence anymore. It was a fuse. And the wedding, that would be the spark. Driving back to Atlanta, I felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over me. Not calmness, not peace. Clarity, sharp, cold, icy enough to hold back the flood of fear threatening to rise in my throat. For months, I had felt powerless, drifting in currents I couldn't control. But now, for the first time, I had direction, a plan, an ally, a truth too dark to ignore and too dangerous to mishandle. My son was lost in something he didn't understand. Celeste was in danger she couldn't see. Angela had woven a web designed to trap everyone she touched. But the old lion stood ready, and so did I. This story, our story, would not end the way she intended. And as the skyline came into view, shimmering beneath the winter sun, I understood something that made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. When justice begins moving, it does not stop for innocence, guilt, or grief. It simply moves, and I was now part of that movement. No turning back, no running, no pretending, only forward, into whatever waited at the altar, into whatever truth would be revealed, into the moment when I would make the call that would change everything. Weddings are supposed to feel holy, But that morning, as I stepped into the cathedral, all I felt was the quiet hum of dread settling beneath my ribs, steady, cold, certain, the kind of dread that doesn't shout. It waits. The stained glass windows cast soft colors across the guests, painting everyone in gentle blues and reds, but nothing could soften the truth I carried in my chest like a concealed weapon. Malcolm stood at the altar, handsome, in a way that should have filled me with pride. But when I looked at him, all I saw were the shadows behind his eyes, shadows shaped by secrets, guilt, and the quiet manipulation of a woman who believed she owned him. Celeste walked down the aisle, glowing, radiant, innocent, unaware she was marrying a man who had been positioned, weaponized, to destroy her. And Angela? Angela sat in the front pew, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm yet hungry. Her gaze never left Malcolm. She looked at him not as a mother-in-law, not even as a conspirator, but as something she had built, something she believed belonged to her. The organ swelled. Guests rose. Soft whispers fluttered like wings across the cathedral, but inside me silence reigned, heavy, suffocating, unmoving. The vows began. Celeste's voice trembled delicately, her smile tender, open, trusting. But Malcolm's words, they rang hollow. They were too smooth, too practiced, too devoid of the boy I raised beside my sewing machine in the West End. Every sentence felt like a line spoken by someone reading from a script written in someone else's hand. I do. The congregation sighed in unison, charmed by the romance of it all. But my stomach tightened. Because the man who said those words wasn't mine anymore. He hadn't been mine for a long time. The reception was held in a ballroom that glittered with money crystal chandeliers, ivory tablecloths, gold accents polished within an inch of perfection. Guests clinked glasses and laughed with a kind of ease people only possess when they believe they are safe. No one in that room was safe. Not Celeste, not Malcolm, not even me. Because the truth was circling now, tightening, ready to strike. When the mother-son dance was announced, I felt a tremor move through my hands, small but insistent. Malcolm approached me, smiling with the same warmth he used to give me as a boy, but now I knew that smile. It was a mask. A mask he'd learned to wear under Angela's instruction. His hand rested on my waist, lightly, politely, not lovingly. He didn't look at me, not really. He looked through me. The music began slow, soft, sentimental. A cruel irony. For a few seconds we moved together in silence. My heart felt too large for my body, pressing against my chest, begging for release. Then I leaned in close enough for only him to hear and whispered the words that changed everything. I know everything. He froze. The smile died on his lips, clean, sharp instant. His eyes snapped to mine, wide and terrified, not of guilt but of exposure. "Mom, what do you—" I cut him off with a look. I didn't need to explain. He understood. Every photograph, every recording, every secret he thought he'd hidden. His hand dropped from my waist. He stepped back as though I had struck him. And that was when the first fracture cracked through the room, a ripple of tension that only I and one other person seemed to feel. Angela. Her head lifted, her eyes narrowed, her entire body sharpened in alertness like a predator sensing a threat near its prey. She rose from her chair before I could blink. I didn't see the bowl at first. I only saw her expression, that terrifying calm. I had seen the first moment she decided I wasn't worth her son's loyalty. Then her arm moved. Fast, violent, intentional. She lunged toward me, lifting a bowl of steaming gumbo from a server's tray with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind. A hiss of heat kissed my cheek a split second before the bowl struck. The impact sent a burst of scalding liquid across my skin, my neck, the bodice of my dress. Pain exploded in a white, blinding rush. Guests screamed, chairs scraped against the floor. A server dropped a tray of champagne flutes, glass shattering like rainfall. Somewhere behind the noise, a woman gasped loudly. "Oh my God, did she?" The room fractured into chaos. But the deepest fracture, the sharpest break, came from the voice I once trusted above all others, Malcolm. "She's right, Mama." His voice sliced through the air, through me, through everything that held us together. Right about what? About my suffering, about the humiliation she had orchestrated, about the betrayal she had fashioned from his vulnerability. His words didn't just wound, they ended something. A quiet, sacred thread snapped inside me, one that had held for as long as he had been my child. My eyes stung, not from tears, but from the burn on my skin. I reached for a linen napkin with trembling fingers, wiping my cheek slowly, deliberately. The pain was sharp, almost electric, but the numbness beneath it was worse. Around me, the room spun in whispers, judgment, confusion, but I didn't look at any of them. Not at Angela, whose face twisted with triumphant rage. Not at Celeste, who stood frozen, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Not at Malcolm, who stared at me with a mixture of fear, shame, and loyalty to the wrong person. I looked only at the exit. Every step toward the door felt heavy but not weak, weighted with purpose. 200 eyes followed me, but none moved to stop me. My dress clung to my skin fabric, sticking where the gumbo had cooled into a viscous film. The sting pulsed with each heartbeat. I kept my spine straight. Dignity can survive even the worst implosions if you let it. Just as I reached the double doors, just as the room behind me erupted into frantic chatter, my phone vibrated. A small, precise vibration. The signal. The world around me quieted, not literally but internally, as if my mind folded the chaos away to make room for something cold and absolute. I lifted the phone to my ear. My voice steadied, sharpened, crystallized. Go. One word, soft, controlled, icy. The kind of word spoken by someone who has finally crossed the point of no return. The doors closed behind me with a quiet thud, sealing the ballroom and my former life on the other side. I stood alone in the hallway, breathing through the dull ache spreading across my cheek. The burn pulsed, the humiliation pulsed, but beneath it all, something stronger pressed upward like a blade rising through earth. Resolve. Not revenge, not rage. Resolve forged from truth, love, fear, and survival. I leaned briefly against the cool marble wall, letting the chill soothe the heat of my skin. The wedding continued behind those doors, but the story had already changed. The moment I whispered, "Go," the old lion of Inman Park began to move. And when he moved, the world would shift with him. The path ahead would be messy, brutal, devastating, but necessary. Because this story, our story, would not end quietly. And neither would I. Midnight has a sound. Not silence, never silence. It has a pulse, a vibration, a faint tremor in the air that warns you a reckoning is coming. I felt that tremor the moment I stepped into the hallway outside the ballroom. The burn on my cheek throbbed, the scent of spices clinging to my skin like a bruise. My dress was still damp with humiliation, but none of it mattered now. Because somewhere across Atlanta, another man, the old lion, was rising from his chair, gathering his lawyers, calling the police, setting justice into motion with a precision born of grief and fury. The moment I whispered, "Go," the world changed its shape. What happened next unfolded like a slow, inevitable avalanche. By midnight, the double doors of the Street Regis lobby burst open, and Harlan Dupree entered not as a guest, not as a grandfather, but as a force. Lawyers flanked him, stern, silent, purposeful. Police officers followed, badges glinting under the chandeliers. Their footsteps echoed across marble floors like the beginning of a storm. Inside the ballroom, the music faltered, guests turning toward the commotion with confusion sharp enough to cut the air. I watched from a distance, unseen, unacknowledged, my body pressed against the cool wall of the corridor. I had become both witness and ghost. It happened quickly, but not violently. Real power never needs to shout. Documents were handed over, evidence placed on tables. Voices did not rise. Faces did. The photographs, the audio, the money trail. They spoke louder than screams ever could. I didn't see the moment Celeste's world shattered, but I felt it. The collapse of innocence has its own frequency. Later, someone told me she fainted as soon as the photographs hit the linen tablecloth. Her body crumpled like lace in a fist. Her bouquet scattered across the floor, petals skittering away like frightened birds. Angela lunged toward her daughter, too late, too frantic, too exposed. Officers stepped between them. Celeste was carried out pale as candle wax, her gown wrinkled beneath the weight of betrayal she never saw coming. Angela's arrest was almost quiet. The clatter of handcuffs, a sharp inhale, a single trembling. "No, this isn't. This is a misunderstanding." But her voice broke. Finally, irrevocably. Police escorted her out past the wealthy guests, who whispered behind manicured hands past the chandeliers she once admired as symbols of her status. Those same chandeliers now illuminated her downfall, bright and merciless. Fraud, conspiracy, manipulation, intent to harm. Charges that would unravel her life thread by thread. Her empire wasn't built on stone, it was built on schemes. And schemes collapse fastest. The trust fund froze before the ink dried on the paperwork. The wedding, only hours old, dissolved before sunrise. Celeste's marriage was annulled with the same efficiency that had always defined the Dupree family. The last ribbon of connection between them and Malcolm snapped. And Malcolm, my son. When I saw him, he was standing alone in the lobby, still in his tuxedo, but it hung off him like wet paper, heavy with shame, clinging to a body that seemed suddenly too small for the mistakes he'd made. Guests passed him like he wasn't there. Or worse, like they wished he wasn't. His name drifted through the room in whispers: monster, pawn, homewrecker. Poor boy, no, not poor, complicit. Did you see the photos? Was he really sleeping with Lord? That mother must be devastated. I stood far back, hidden in shadow. He didn't see me. I don't know if I wanted him to. His hands were in his hair, his breathing shallow, his eyes unfocused, as if he finally realized the size of the life he had ruined and that most of the damage had been his own. This wasn't victory for me. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't even justice. It was sorrow, heavy, ancient, whole. Because when the world destroys your child, even if he built the weapon himself, the wound opens in you first. I left before he could look up, before he could see the truth in my eyes, before compassion or anger or heartbreak could pull me back into his orbit. For the first time in months, I walked away on my own terms. 2 weeks passed. 2 slow, aching, disorienting weeks. News traveled fast. Angela's mugshot appeared on every local station. Celeste retreated into her family estate. The Duprees sealed their world shut like a vault. And Malcolm? He vanished. No calls. No texts. No sightings. Just absence thick and impenetrable. I told myself I didn't want to know where he was. That distance was necessary, that a wound cannot heal if someone keeps touching it. But every night when the world went quiet, my heart reached for the boy he used to be, the boy who once sat beside me in the West End sewing shop doing homework to the rhythm of my machine. I wondered if that boy had died inside the man he became, or if he was still in there, trapped under layers of shame and influence and hunger for approval that had poisoned him. 2 weeks after the wedding, a knock came at my apartment door. Soft, unsteady, almost apologetic. My heart froze. I knew that knock. I opened the door slowly, bracing myself, preparing for anger, for pleading, for collapse. But nothing prepared me for the sight of him. Malcolm stood in the hallway, thin, tired, hollowed out. His shoulders slumped inward as if trying to escape the weight of his own regrets. His eyes, once so full of light, were dark, swollen, rimmed with exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from a soul dragged through too much truth too quickly. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. He swallowed, tried again. "Mama," His voice cracked mid-word. My chest tightened painfully. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The words trembled, then broke apart. He looked so young in that moment, so unbearably small. Like the boy who once ran to me after scraping his knee, except now the wound was deeper, invisible, and entirely his own doing. Can I stay here a while?" Silence settled between us. Heavy, long, necessary. I studied him the way a mother studies a child she loves enough to tell the truth, even when it hurts, even when it kills something inside her. His face sagged with desperation. His hands shook slightly at his sides. But beneath the remorse, beneath the sorrow, beneath the ruined edges of who he'd been, I saw something unmistakable. He still didn't understand. Not fully, not truly, not deeply enough to change. Pain had gutted him. Yes, but pain alone does not rebuild a man. It only breaks him open. What he needed wasn't shelter. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't even forgiveness. What he needed was to face himself without a shield. So I breathed in slowly, painfully, fully, and I said the hardest thing I have ever said to my child. "No." He blinked, stunned. A small sound escaped him, half gasp, half sob. I stepped closer, resting a hand on the doorframe, not to steady myself, to steady the truth. "Pain made you this way," I said gently. "And pain will have to unmake you." His face crumpled. Tears rose, finally rising, but still he waited, hoping I would change my mind. I didn't. "You can't stay here," I whispered. "Not yet. Not like this." A single tear slipped down his cheek. "Mama, please." I shook my head. Not in anger, not in rejection, in love. The kind of love that understands that rescue given too soon is just another form of enabling. The kind of love that leaves the wound open long enough for truth to seep in. He bowed his head, shoulders trembling. For a moment I thought he might collapse to the floor. But he didn't. He turned, slowly, brokenly, and walked away. Each step echoed through the hallway like a heartbeat being pressed flat. I closed the door gently, resting my forehead against the wood. I didn't cry. Not then. Sometimes a mother's strength is measured not by how fiercely she holds on, but by how bravely she lets go. Later that night, as the city hummed outside my window, I felt the shape of something shifting, not peace, not relief, not yet, but the faintest outline of acceptance. I didn't know what path Malcolm would take. I didn't know how far he would fall before he learned to rise again. I didn't know what remained between us. But I knew this. Some truths break us, some truths rebuild us, and some truths must be faced alone. And in the stillness of my small apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the life I had stitched together, stitch by stitch, I whispered a single sentence into the dark. Let this pain unmake you into someone better. Whether he heard it miles away crying into the night, I will never know. 2 years have passed, though sometimes it feels like only a handful of breaths separate me from the night everything collapsed. Other times it feels like a lifetime ago, something that happened to another woman in another story. Time has a way of distorting pain, stretching it, softening its edges, but never fully erasing its weight. Angela Dupree now serves a 12-year federal sentence. 12 years, an entire era of her life, confined to concrete and steel. I don't think of her often, and when I do, it isn't with triumph. There is no victory in watching someone destroy themselves. Only a quiet, resigned understanding that choices always lead somewhere, and hers led her exactly where she had been walking all along. How ironic that the woman who believed she could control every thread of her world ended up losing all of them in one pull. And Celeste? Sweet, gentle Celeste. She is rebuilding her life the way people rebuild after a fire, slowly, delicately sorting through the ashes for anything that survived. The annulment went through before the sun rose the morning after the wedding, but the emotional unraveling took far longer. I've seen her only twice since then. once at a charity event downtown where she stood surrounded by friends but somehow still looked alone. Her eyes had changed, older, sadder, but also steadier. She nodded at me from across the room, a gesture small enough to ignore but full enough to understand. I'm healing. I'm trying. Thank you for not letting me burn. The second time was at a cafe in Midtown. She sat by the window with a cup of tea she barely touched. When she looked up and saw me, we held each other's gaze long enough for acknowledgement, then returned to our separate worlds. No words exchanged, none needed. Between women who've survived the same storm, silence can be its own language. And Malcolm, my son. He lives alone in a small room in Norcross, the kind of room that humbles you the moment you step inside. Peeling wallpaper, a narrow bed, a small desk with a lamp that flickers if you touch it wrong. He works factory shifts on the assembly line, long hours that wear down the body but slowly rebuild the soul. He attends therapy twice a week, anger management, trauma recovery, accountability sessions. His counselor once sent me a letter asking gently whether I wished to attend a joint meeting. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because healing isn't something you can drag someone into before they can walk on their own. He writes me letters sometimes. Thick ones, thin ones, folded ones, ones written in careful print, others scribbled in a rush of emotion. They arrive irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes 3 in a single week. He writes about his job, about how the machines terrify him less now, how repetition helps quiet the noise in his head, how therapy makes him feel raw but alive, how guilt still claws at him at night but doesn't swallow him whole the way it used to. He writes apologies, hundreds of them layered between lines of his slow return to himself. He writes memories of the West End, of my sewing table, of the nights he fell asleep listening to the hum of my machine, of the mornings I kissed the top of his head before sending him to school. He writes things he should have said years ago, and things he should never have done. But the most striking part of every letter is something simpler he is trying, not performing, not manipulating, not begging, trying. And that, I have learned, is its own kind of redemption. I haven't answered him, not once. But some nights when the city quiets and the streetlights cast long shadows across my living room, I read his letters twice, not because I'm ready to forgive him, not because the wounds have faded, but because healing for both of us requires space and distance, and a kind of love that doesn't suffocate, doesn't rescue too quickly, doesn't pretend that consequences can be lifted simply by wishing them away. I read his letters twice because part of me still hopes, and another part of me knows that hope must grow slowly, or it will die the moment it touches reality. 2 years have taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. Redemption isn't owed. It's earned. In days. In choices. In quiet acts no one applauds. He is earning something, not forgiveness, not yet, but a version of himself he can finally live with. As for me, I live differently now. My sewing shop remains my sanctuary, but I no longer fill it with the frantic purpose of a woman trying to prove her worth. I work fewer hours, I breathe more, I sit by the window sometimes and let the light fall across my hands the way I never let myself before. I volunteer at the community center on weekends, teaching single mothers how to repair clothes, hem pants, stretch their budgets, small skills, but ones that stitch dignity back into lives stretched thin. And sometimes, late in the evening, I walk through Inman Park, where the air is soft and the magnolia trees hold the scent of something old and tender. I pass by Harlan's home on occasion. I never knock. I never enter. But I look at the windows glowing from inside and I feel something quiet and grateful stir in me. He saved his granddaughter. He saved my son from becoming a monster he could never come back from. He saved all of us in ways the world will never understand. Some debts cannot be spoken aloud. They live in the space between breaths, in nods, exchanged from across rooms, in shared silences that say, "We survived something that didn't want us to." And I suppose that's enough. Life has not returned to what it was. It never will. But life has continued, reshaped itself, found new rhythms that feel less brittle than before. Sometimes I wonder if I will ever let Malcolm back into my home. Sometimes I wonder if forgiving him means betraying the woman I was when he broke me. Sometimes I wonder if forgiveness is a place I must reach, or a direction I must begin walking toward. For now, I simply stand still and breathe. Forgiveness, when it comes, will not erase what happened. It will not excuse it. It will not rewrite the past or justify the harm. Forgiveness, I am learning, is not forgetting. It is choosing not to carry the fire anymore. The fire that scorches everything it touches, trust, sleep, joy, the fragile hope that people can be better than their mistakes, the fire that once filled my chest, leaving no room for breath. Laying that fire down does not absolve him. It frees me. European American or any grown soul knows this truth. Love saves, but only when paired with boundaries. Without boundaries, love becomes sacrifice. And sacrifice unchecked becomes erasure. I will not erase myself again. Not for my son. Not for anyone. And sometimes, though the world teaches us otherwise, the hardest love is the love that lets someone fall, because falling is the only way they will ever learn how to rise. As I place his latest unopened letter on the table, I trace the corner of the envelope with my fingertip. Not ready. Not yet. But perhaps someday. Outside, the city hums with its usual restlessness, unaware of the quiet shifts happening inside me. And for the first time in 2 years, I exhale without feeling the weight of fire in my lungs. Whatever comes next for me, for Celeste, for the old lion, for the boy I raised and the man he is becoming, I finally believe we are moving towards something gentler, not perfect, not simple, but human. And perhaps that is enough. In the end, every story about family becomes a quiet meditation on what love is and what it is not. We grow up believing love is a fortress, something unbreakable, something that can withstand betrayal, pride, fear, even silence. But adulthood teaches us a harder truth. Love is not a shield. It is a responsibility. A choice we must make again and again, even when it hurts, even when the path forward is dim. Forgiveness, too, is not a single act. It is a long road, one we walk barefoot, carrying the weight of everything we've survived. And while redemption can be earned, forgiveness is never owed. It is given only when we are strong enough to loosen our grip on the past. Not to erase it, never to erase it, but to reclaim ourselves from it. Pain changes people. Sometimes it warps them. Sometimes it wakes them. And sometimes, if we are brave enough to stand still and look directly at what we've lost, pain can unmake us just enough for us to be rebuilt, slowly, deliberately, with better foundations than before. The truth for any grown soul in Europe, America, or anywhere life tests us remains simple. Love saves, but only when paired with boundaries. Compassion heals, but only when held alongside truth. And the hardest love is often the love that lets someone fall, not to punish them, but to give them back the chance to rise. Thank you for staying with me through this journey, through the shadows, the unraveling, and the quiet rebuilding. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a pain you've carried or a boundary you've had to draw, know this: you are not alone, and your story matters too. Take care of yourselves, be gentle with your healing, and I'll see you in the next chapter.